At 9:41 a.m. on April 5, 1944, a B-17G flying fortress named Iron Annie crossed into Axis airspace over the Romanian coastline at 27,000 feet. At the controls sat Second Lieutenant Harold Hank Cavanaugh, 23 years old, 91 combat hours logged, 14 missions into a tour that required 25. Iron Annie belonged to the 97th Bombardment Group, 344th Bombardment Squadron, flying out of Amendola Airfield in southern Italy. She carried a crew of 10 and a payload of 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs targeted at the Ploiești oil refinery complex, the single largest source of refined fuel for the German war machine. The Germans defending Ploiești knew the Americans were coming. They always knew. Around the refinery, German and Romanian anti-aircraft batteries numbered more than 240 heavy guns. In another 52 lighter Flak emplacements ringed the outer perimeter. Above the cloud deck, somewhere between 30 and 40 Messerschmitt Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 77 were already climbing. The mission was simple on paper. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17 over Ploiești, 3 would not return. For the 97th Bomb Group alone in that spring campaign, the loss rate ran close to 1 aircraft per mission day. Simple on paper, never simple in the air. The crew of Iron Annie had been flying together for 11 missions. Second Lieutenant Harold Cavanaugh, pilot, age 23, from Scranton, Pennsylvania, the son of a coal company foreman who had never once flown in a civilian aircraft before the Army put him in a trainer. Second Lieutenant Thomas Reyes, co-pilot, age 22, from Tucson, Arizona, the youngest officer on the crew, left-handed, in which the other men found inexplicably unsettling. Second Lieutenant Owen Marsh, navigator, age 24, from Portland, Oregon, a cartographer's assistant before the war, meticulous enough to label the rivers on his personal maps in 2 colors. Staff Sergeant Darnell Pruitt, bombardier, age 25, from Memphis, Tennessee, the crew's unofficial cook on stand-down days, famous for reconstituting powdered eggs into something no one could identify but everyone ate. Technical Sergeant Walter Kowalski, flight engineer and top turret gunner, age 27, from Chicago, Illinois, the oldest man aboard, called Pop without irony. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cross, radio operator, age 22, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Staff Sergeant Emil Brandt, ball turret gunner, age 20, from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, smallest man on the crew, which was the only reason he fit in the ball turret. Staff Sergeant Clarence Dutch Hoare, waist gunner, age 24, from Cincinnati, Ohio. Staff Sergeant Lowell Fitch, waist gunner, age 23, from Knoxville, Tennessee. Sergeant Martin Ash, tail gunner, age 21, from Providence, Rhode Island, the newest man on only his 4th mission. Iron Annie, the name painted in black block letters below the cockpit, had been named by a previous crew for no reason anyone still aboard could verify. She was a Block 45 B-17G, olive drab over neutral gray, 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone engines, wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches, maximum bomb load 17,600 pounds, maximum range at cruise 2,000 miles. The mission, destroy the Ploiești cracking plant number 4, which processed an estimated 11,500 barrels of crude per day into aviation fuel. One direct hit on the distillation columns would reduce that to 0 for a minimum of 6 weeks. The 340th launched 18 aircraft that morning. Iron Annie flew in the low-element 3rd box right-wing position, a place experienced crews called Purple Heart Corner. The formation pressed northeast across the Adriatic. Beneath them, the sea was flat gray. Above them, the contrails of the lead element stitched white lines across a cold sky at -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere ahead, 240 guns were waiting. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join. 10 seconds to sign up. Link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you, and the formation reached the initial point, the fixed coordinate from which no evasive action was permitted. At 9:38 a.m. From the IP to the target was 4 minutes and 40 seconds of straight level flight. No turns, no altitude changes. 4 minutes and 40 seconds during which every 88mm Flak 36 battery in the Ploiești defense network could calculate, lead, and fire. The Flak began at 9:39, not the scattered probing rounds that came early in the run. The Germans opened with a coordinated barrage, a timed fuse wall of 88mm projectiles detonating at a pre-calculated altitude band between 26,500 and 27,200 feet. Each shell produced a fragmentation pattern 60 feet in diameter. The batteries were firing in waves of 6, staggered by 3-second intervals to fill the airspace continuously. Iron Annie entered the barrage at 9:40 a.m. The first burst detonated 80 feet forward and 15 feet below the nose. The overpressure shattered the plexiglass nose cone entirely. A second burst, 4 seconds later, at 9:40:04, detonated directly beneath the forward fuselage. The effect was not an explosion, it was erasure. The entire nose section forward of Frame Station 4, approximately 6 feet of aircraft, ceased to exist. The bombardier's compartment, the chin turret, the forward oxygen system manifold, the pitot tube assembly, and both forward landing light bays were gone. The bombardier's seat was still attached to a 12-inch fragment of fuselage frame that was no longer attached to anything else. Staff Sergeant Darnell Pruitt, age 25, from Memphis, Tennessee, died in that instant. Sergeant Martin Ash, reporting from the tail position, I saw a debris cloud exit the front of the aircraft and vanish into the slipstream. He would later describe it as watching the aircraft eat itself. Cavanaugh felt the aircraft pitch nose down in the same second, not a gradual transition, instantaneous. The removal of 6 feet of forward fuselage and the mass it contained, approximately 840 pounds of structure, equipment, and crew, shifted the center of gravity rearward in under 1 second. The B-17G's design center of gravity range was 17 to 30% mean aerodynamic chord. Iron Annie's CG had just jumped aft of that limit. The nose dropped. The bomber began to accelerate downward. At 27,000 feet with the forward pressure bulkhead gone, the cockpit was now open to 175-knot slipstream at -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Cavanaugh pulled back on the yoke. It moved. Barely. The control cables were still intact, and he didn't know for how long. The yoke resistance told Cavanaugh everything he needed to know and almost nothing he needed to act on. The B-17G's elevator control system ran 2 separate cable circuits, primary and secondary, from the cockpit control column back through the fuselage to the horizontal stabilizer. Under normal conditions, a pilot applying back pressure moved the elevator up, generating lift at the tail, which raised the nose. The system was deliberately over-engineered. The cables were 3 16-inch diameter aircraft-grade steel braid, rated to over 1,000 pounds of tensile load each. The nose destruction had not severed the cables. It had removed the aerodynamic structure that made the cables useful. Specifically, the bombardier's compartment had housed the forward ballast bay and a portion of the fuselage frame that gave the aircraft its designed weight distribution. Without that weight forward, the aircraft was tail-heavy, severely dangerously tail-heavy, and no amount of elevator input could fully compensate because the elevator itself was being asked to fight the physics of a misbalanced airframe rather than trim it. There was also a second problem. The open nose was now functioning as a ram air intake. At 27,000 feet and 190 miles per hour, the dynamic pressure entering through the destroyed nose section was creating asymmetrical internal pressurization across the fuselage. The drag increase was measurable, and the fuel burn rate had increased by an amount Cavanaugh could not calculate precisely but estimated at 15 to 20% above normal. What Cavanaugh had: 2 cable circuits, still functionally intact, engine power on all 4 right cyclones at least for the moment, an altimeter, a compass, an airspeed indicator. What he did not have: a bombardier, a nose, forward visibility below the horizon, his oxygen system for the forward crew stations, his pitot heat, meaning his airspeed indicator would ice over and become unreliable inside 4 minutes. Navigator Owen Marsh came forward. He braced himself in the opening where the forward bulkhead used to be, wrapped one arm around a structural brace and stared into the open sky where the nose of the aircraft had been. Wind was moving through the cockpit at full slipstream velocity. Marsh's oxygen mask was the only thing standing between him and hypoxia at altitude. He looked at Cavanaugh. He held up his hands, fingers spread, and made a pulling motion. Downward. Cavanaugh understood. The nose needed weight forward, something to replace the aerodynamic anchor they had lost. Flight engineer Kowalski was already moving before Cavanaugh could order it. He pulled the emergency ballast bag, a 60-pound sandbag mounted in the top of the forward fuselage for exactly this theoretical contingency, and physically threw it forward into the open nose bay. It did not solve the problem. It reduced the severity. The descent rate was 800 feet per minute when the ballast moved. It dropped to approximately 500. Iron Annie was still falling, just more slowly. Cavanaugh advanced the throttles to maximum continuous power, 1,200 horsepower per engine, all 4 engines 4,800 horsepower total, and pulled back on the yoke with both hands. The nose came up 5 degrees. He held it there, both arms trembling against the aerodynamic pressure and the physics of a broken machine. They had found a configuration that could sustain something approximating level flight, losing altitude, losing fuel, losing temperature, but still flying. Survival was possible. It was not stable. At 9:46 a.m., 6 minutes into the crisis, Iron Annie had descended from 27,000 to 24,800 feet. The Flak had stopped. The formation had passed through the target zone, dropped, and turned south. Iron Annie had not dropped. The bomb bay was still loaded. Cavanaugh had no bombardier to release the payload, and the salvo toggle, the emergency manual release, was located in the destroyed nose section. The bombs were still aboard, 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs. 6,000 pounds of ordnance that Cavanaugh could not release. He was flying a tail-heavy, nose-destroyed aircraft with dead weight forward and live weight in the belly that he could not shed. At 9:47 a.m., Technical Sergeant Kowalski's voice came over the interphone. "Pilot, engineer, Number 3 engine, oil pressure dropping. Number 3, the inboard engine on the starboard wing, was reading 45 pounds per square inch and falling. Normal operating pressure was 75 pounds per square inch minimum. Below 30, the engine would seize. Kowalski had been watching the gauge for 90 seconds before calling it, hoping it would stabilize. It did not, and Cavanaugh told Kowalski to feather number 3 before it seized and shed fragments into number 4. Kowalski pulled the feathering control. The propeller blades rotated 90 degrees to the airflow, stopping windmill drag. But Iron Annie now had 3 engines. The asymmetric thrust, 3 engines on the port side and outboard starboard, nothing inboard starboard, began to pull the aircraft into a right yaw. Cavanaugh applied left rudder. The rudder pedals, connected by the same cable system as the elevator, responded sluggishly through the aerodynamic turbulence pouring into the open nose. From the waist positions, Dutch Hoare and Lowell Fitch had been watching the right wing. Hoare called it first. "Pilot waist, number 3 nacelle, there's something wrong." Cavanaugh could not see the starboard engines from his seat, and the cowling of number 3 was his blind spot. He asked for specifics. Fitch came on. "Streaking. The nacelle cowling is streaking. Oil or fuel, can't tell. Dripping back along the wing." If it was oil, they had already seen it on the pressure gauge. If it was fuel, the picture changed completely. An 88mm fragment could have nicked a fuel line in the number 3 nacelle on the same burst that killed the oil pressure. Avgas vapor near a hot engine nacelle in a 175-knot slipstream was a predictable conclusion. Kowalski was already at the starboard wing inspection window. He looked for 11 seconds. "Fuel," he said. "Fuel leak, coming from the nacelle drain." He did not say what he was looking at. He didn't need to. The fuel drain of number 3 was open, either damaged or partially open from the Flak impact, and in the time between engine shutdown and his inspection, approximately 4 minutes, an unknown quantity of 100-octane aviation fuel had been streaming back along the wing undersurface. It had not ignited. Hot engine metal and raw fuel in close proximity gave that situation a limited future. Iron Annie was now flying with a destroyed nose, a dead engine, a fuel leak from a damaged nacelle, an undroppable bomb load, and a descent rate she could not arrest. She was still flying. For the moment, the crew knew what both problems meant together. The aircraft did not tell them how long they had. At 9:50 a.m., the last aircraft of the 340th Bombardment Squadron passed Iron Annie on the left. The tail markings, a white triangle on black square, Momo, slid by at roughly 50 yards separation and continued south, descending toward lower altitude as the formation departed the target area. Cavanaugh watched the dark shapes pull away for approximately 40 seconds. The shapes grew smaller. Then they became silhouettes. Then they were contrail traces against the high sky. Iron Annie was alone. The altimeter read 23,400 feet. The descent rate was approximately 400 feet per minute, better than before but still falling. On 3 engines into a headwind, with drag from the open nose cavity and a fuel system she was bleeding from, she was not going to climb. She might be able to hold a shallower descent. She could not stop it. Cavanaugh ran the math. Distance to the Adriatic coast of Italy from their current position, approximately 380 nautical miles. At cruise speed of 182 knots over the ground, that was 125 minutes of flight. At current altitude loss rate of 400 feet per minute, 125 minutes represented an altitude loss of 50,000 feet. They had 23,400 feet. The numbers did not work, not at this descent rate. Not without the fuel picture. The fuel picture was unknown. Cross at the radio position had no way to read the nacelle tank gauges for number 3, which were now meaningless. The tank was venting. The main wing tank gauges showed approximately 800 gallons remaining across all cells, but those readings didn't account for what had already vented overboard. Navigator Marsh, wedged in the cockpit with his maps frozen and his compass still operational, gave Cavanaugh the heading. 235 degrees. Southwest. Aim for the Italian boot. Hope the coast was close enough. At 9:52 a.m., Kowalski called from the top turret position. Pilot, tail assembly. He had been watching the horizontal stabilizer through the top turret plexiglass. The port side elevator, the left horizontal control surface, was deflecting abnormally on Cavanaugh's up elevator inputs. It was moving, but the range of motion was reduced, not by control input, by structure. A fragment, they would later determine it was from the initial second burst, had lodged in the left elevator hinge assembly. The elevator was still functional partially. The hinge was cracked. Under sustained aerodynamic load, it would fail. When it did, the elevator would depart the aircraft. When that happened, Iron Annie could not be flown by any human being. Cavanaugh did not have a time estimate for when the hinge would fail. Neither did Kowalski. Neither did anyone else on the aircraft. And the aircraft was flying on borrowed time and borrowed structure. Fly southwest. Get to the Adriatic. Get home. He did not think about how many minutes that calculation was missing. At 9:54 a.m., Cavanaugh made the calculation. It was not emotional. It was engineering. The aircraft had one control surface approaching structural failure, a fuel system of unknown integrity, and a descent gradient that would place them somewhere over Yugoslavia or the Adriatic at some altitude below 10,000 feet inside the next 90 minutes, assuming nothing else failed. If the elevator hinge departed, he would lose pitch authority instantly and completely. The bomber would enter an unrecoverable dive. If that happened while the crew was still aboard, the aircraft's terminal velocity dive would produce G-forces that would make parachute evacuation impossible. And he called the order at 9:55 a.m. Bailout. All crew. Now. He did not call it as a question. There was no vote. He stated the altitude, 22,100 feet. The outside temperature, -36 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heading. He told them they were over northwestern Romania and to walk southwest. Lowell Fitch went first from the waist exit, 9:55:20 a.m. Dutch Hoare followed, 9:55:31 a.m. Each man who left took weight from the rear of the aircraft. Each departure made the tail lighter, which made the tail heaviness slightly worse, which increased the back pressure required on the yoke to maintain level flight. Cavanaugh felt it with each exit, a barely perceptible but real increase in the load he was fighting. Emil Brandt came up out of the ball turret at 9:56 a.m. The ball turret was electrically driven, and it took him 45 seconds to rotate to exit position and climb out. 9:56:48 a.m. Raymond Cross, the radio operator, keyed a final transmission before bailing out. Position, condition, crew evacuating. He did not know if anyone received it. 9:57:05 a.m. Martin Ash, the tail gunner, had to walk the full length of the fuselage to reach the waist exit. He passed Cavanaugh without stopping. He did not look at the cockpit. He looked straight ahead and walked at the pace of a man crossing a street against a light. 9:57:22 a.m. Kowalski went last from the rear crew, from the top hatch above the cockpit. He braced himself in the opening, looked at Cavanaugh through the plexiglass above the pilot seat, and did not move for 3 seconds. He was checking the instrument panel, not saying goodbye. Oil pressure on engines 1, 2, and 4. Airspeed. Altitude. He read the gauges as a final gift to the man who would need them. Then he went. 9:58:10 a.m. Then Reyes, the co-pilot. Reyes unbuckled his harness. He stood in the cockpit space between the seats. He looked at Cavanaugh. Cavanaugh looked back. They held eye contact for slightly under 2 seconds. Whatever Reyes wanted to say or couldn't say or didn't need to say, he turned and went through the hatch. 9:58:40 a.m. The aircraft lurched when he left. Marsh went at 9:59 a.m., the last man besides Cavanaugh. He had folded his maps into his jacket pocket. He stopped once at the exit and looked back. Not at Cavanaugh, at the cockpit instruments visible through the bulkhead gap. The navigator's reflex, reading position to the last second. Then he was gone. Cavanaugh was alone in the aircraft. Altitude, 21,200 feet, in 3 engines. Unknown fuel. Descent rate, 450 feet per minute and increasing. The elevator hinge was still holding. The wind through the open nose was 176 knots and -36 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was tearing at every unsecured item in the cockpit. He waited. Cavanaugh needed 2 minutes, maybe less. The parachutes of 9 men were open and falling somewhere in the airspace below and behind the aircraft. 2 minutes of separation at terminal velocity, roughly 120 feet per second. Put each man approximately 14,000 feet below him. Out of his slipstream. Out of danger from the falling aircraft. He checked the altimeter. 20,400 feet. The elevator response was degrading. He could feel it in the yoke, the input returning less feedback, the control surface travel completing with less authority than it had at 9:41 that morning, and the hinge was moving through its remaining structural margin. It was not a guess. It was in the yoke, in his hands, transmitted up through the cable system like a failing handshake. He unbuckled the lap harness, then the shoulder harness, then the radio cord at his helmet. Standing in the cockpit of a B-17G with the forward nose section gone meant standing in a direct 176-knot wind tunnel at -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The force of the slipstream against his body was approximately 210 pounds of lateral pressure. He held the instrument panel with both hands and moved toward the hatch above the co-pilot's seat. He pulled the hatch release. The slipstream immediately tried to tear it from his hands. He held it, turned it, and pushed it into the slipstream where it departed the aircraft with enough velocity to vanish in half a second. And he looked at the altimeter from the cockpit floor, 19,800 feet. The aircraft was beginning to buffet in a new frequency, not the turbulence of damaged structure and asymmetric thrust. Something new. The onset of a divergent pitch oscillation, the aircraft losing its trim equilibrium. The elevator hinge was no longer holding the surface in a stable position. It was moving, hunting. The aircraft was beginning to seek its own pitch independent of control input. He pulled himself up through the hatch. The slipstream took him, not violently. There was an instant of disorientation as the cockpit environment ceased, and he was in free fall and wind, and the aircraft was still there, moving away from him, and he counted 2 seconds before pulling the D-ring. And the parachute canopy opened with a jerk that loaded approximately 12 Gs instantaneously through his harness. Then there was silence. The roaring wind became nothing. The sky was enormous and blue and absolutely quiet. He watched Iron Annie below him. She was in a nose-down attitude at approximately 30 degrees and increasing. The left elevator surface departed the horizontal stabilizer at what he estimated was 18,000 feet. He saw the surface separate and fall away, tumbling, catching sunlight for one rotation before it was too small to track. The aircraft went to 60 degrees nose down, then vertical, then past vertical into an inverted attitude, and the wings departed somewhere below 12,000 feet. The fuselage, engines, bomb bay, tail section, everything that had been Iron Annie, struck the ground in northwestern Romania, and he saw the smoke column rise. If he had stayed 30 more seconds aboard, the G-forces of that terminal dive would have held him in his seat like a man nailed to a wall. He would have ridden the aircraft into the ground. He descended into Romanian farmland. Cavanaugh landed in a harvested wheat field at approximately 10:27 a.m. The ground was frozen. The parachute landing fall he had practiced in training assumed a grass surface at mild temperatures. He came down on his right side in a field that had the texture and compliance of packed concrete. He hurt his right ankle before he felt it, a sharp, percussive crack that he later described as sounding like a dry stick broken over a knee. He lay on his back for approximately 3 minutes. He removed his parachute harness. He took inventory. Right ankle fractured, likely both the fibula and distal tibia. He could not rotate the foot, and the pain on dorsiflexion was diagnostic even without x-rays. He could not walk without full weight bearing on a fracture he couldn't splint. He was still on the ground when the German soldiers arrived. There were 4 of them. Regular Wehrmacht Heer, infantry, not SS. They came across the field in a line, rifles slung, not pointed. The lead soldier, a Feldwebel, a staff sergeant equivalent, looked at Cavanaugh's ankle, looked at his face, and said something in German that Cavanaugh did not understand. Then the Feldwebel crouched down and looked at the ankle with what Cavanaugh later described as a doctor's eyes, not a guard's eyes. A German field medic arrived within 20 minutes. He administered morphine, 15 milligrams, 1 syringe, standard Wehrmacht field issue. He applied a rigid splint from the knee to the midfoot using 2 boards from a fence post and linen bandage strips. He did not speak English. He worked without conversation, without commentary, with the economical precision of someone who had splinted field injuries many times before. He was competent. The fracture, confirmed later at Stalag Luft 3 as a bimalleolar fracture with minor displacement, required a plaster cast applied 3 days after capture at a Wehrmacht medical station in Focșani, Romania. The cast ran from below the knee to the base of the toes. The other crew members were captured across a radius of approximately 9 miles over the following 6 hours. Reyes was found in a farmyard, uninjured, by Romanian gendarmerie at 11:15 a.m. A Marsh had broken 2 ribs on landing and was found by the same Wehrmacht infantry unit that had taken Cavanaugh, approximately 4 kilometers northwest, at 12:40 p.m. Kowalski, Brandt, Cross, Herr, Fitch, and Ash were rounded up between noon and 4 p.m. across the same agricultural area. All 7 survivors were consolidated at a temporary holding facility in Focșani by April 7th and transferred to Stalag Luft 3, the Luft 3 complex near Sagan in what is now Poland, by April 19, 1944. The camp held approximately 10,000 Allied prisoners of war at that time. The Germans generally adhered to Geneva Convention provisions for officer prisoners. Food was inadequate. Cold was constant. The men filled the hours with chess, with books passed hand to hand until the covers fell off, with news parsed from Red Cross parcels and cryptic BBC broadcasts. Cavanaugh walked on crutches through April. The cast came off in late May. He walked in June. The winter of 1944 to 1945 arrived with unusual severity. Prisoners at Stalag Luft 3 were evacuated on forced marches westward in late January 1945 as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Column after column of Allied prisoners moving through snow and sub-zero temperatures for distances ranging from 40 to 80 miles, carrying whatever they owned. The 97th Bomb Group's enlisted men in other compounds did the same. Cavanaugh's compound was liberated by American forces on May 2, 1945. He weighed 134 pounds. Before the war, he had weighed 178. Harold Cavanaugh returned to Scranton, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1945. He did not talk about the war. His daughter, interviewed decades later, said that the subject was not forbidden in their house. It simply never came up, the way the weather of a specific Tuesday never comes up. He went to work for an engineering firm. He spent 31 years as a structural engineer, which some of his surviving crew members found funny in a way they never fully explained. The Army awarded Cavanaugh the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on April 5, 1944, specifically for remaining at the controls to allow his crew to evacuate rather than bailing out at the moment the aircraft became uncontrollable. The commendation noted that the time differential between crew evacuation and aircraft structural failure was estimated at under 3 minutes. The crew reunited twice, once in 1968 in Chicago, once in 1979 in Tucson. Thomas Reyes hosted the second reunion. Then Owen Marsh drove from Portland. Emil Brandt and Dutch Hoer drove together from the Midwest. What they talked about in the main was the jobs they'd had, the children they'd raised, the things that had broken well and the things that had broken badly in the years between then and now. They did not talk at length about April 5, 1944. They talked around it. They all understood what the circle in the conversation meant. They talked briefly about Darnell Pruitt, 25 years old from Memphis, Tennessee, about the eggs he used to make, about how they never tasted like eggs at all, about how they ate them anyway, every time, without complaint. They did not mention Martin Ash as often or as long, because Ash had been the newest man and they had known him for only 4 missions, which is not much time to know someone in any context. But they mentioned him. They always mentioned him. 21 years old from Providence, Rhode Island, 4 missions flown. He had walked past the cockpit at a measured pace and had never looked back, and that was the last any of them saw of him, and it had been enough. Harold Cavanaugh died in 2003 at age 82 in Scranton. Walter Kowalski outlived him by 2 years. What happened on April 5, 1944 was not mystical. The aircraft failed according to the laws of physics. The crew responded according to the limits of their training and the decisions of one man who stayed at the controls while the others went out the hatch. The physics of the dying aircraft, the descent gradient, the failing hinge, the undroppable bombs, the unknown fuel, did not care about any of it. They simply were. Human will did not defy those limits. It worked within them, precisely enough and just barely long enough to get 8 men home. Darnell Pruitt, Martin Ash. They never came home. The 8 men who did never forgot that. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive.